She stood at the back of the church with tears running down her face, and nobody in that room thought anything of it. The flowers were perfect. The music was perfect. The light was coming through the stained glass and landing on the aisle in a way that made everything look like a dream someone had carefully arranged just for that afternoon. And when the guests turned and saw her standing there, dabbing at her eyes with the back of her hand, they smiled at her the way you smile at someone who is feeling too much because the moment is too beautiful to hold. That is what everyone believed. That is what everyone wanted to believe. Her name was Patricia. And the tears on her face that afternoon were not tears of joy. They were something else entirely. Something that would take me 5 years to understand. Her name was Patricia. She was 61 years old that day, elegant in a pale blue dress she had picked herself, and she had driven 2 hours to be at that church because her son was getting married. Her son, Daniel, was standing at the altar, hands clasped in front of him, doing that thing he always did when he was nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. And when someone told him later that his mother had been crying at the back of the church before the ceremony even started, he put his hand over his heart and said, "She never cries. She must really love Rachel." He said my name like it was the most natural thing in the world. And for him, in that moment, it was. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. My name is Rachel. And this is the story of the day I married the man I loved, and the woman who watched me do it with a secret folded so tightly inside her chest that she could barely breathe. What I did not know on my wedding day, and what my husband did not know for 5 years after it, was that those tears had nothing to do with joy. Patricia was not standing at the back of that church overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment. She was standing there because she had made a decision she could not undo, a decision with roots that stretched back years before I ever walked into their lives. And watching me walk down that aisle toward her son, in a dress she had told me was beautiful, carrying flowers she had helped me choose, something inside her cracked. Not enough for anyone else to see. Just enough for the tears to come. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly what Patricia was carrying that day. And I promise you, it will change the way you look at the people standing at the back of every wedding you have ever attended. Before we go any further, we would love to know where you are watching this from. Drop your city or your country in the comments below, because this community stretches across so many time zones, and we want to hear from all of you. And if you are not yet subscribed to Claudia's Untold Stories, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What we are about to get into is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends. I want to start where everything starts in a story like this. Not at the wedding, but before it. Because the wedding was only the moment when everything that had already been set in motion became visible if you were watching closely enough. And nobody was watching closely enough. Not Daniel. Not me. Not any of the 112 people who sat in those pews with their programs and their quiet belief that what they were witnessing was simple. Love stories are supposed to be simple. This one was not. And the further back I trace it, the more I understand that the seeds of everything that happened were planted long before I arrived, in a family history I was never fully shown. I met Daniel at a work conference in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the fall of 2012. I was 32 years old, recently out of a relationship that had taken more from me than I realized while I was still in it, and I was not looking for anything. That particular cliché turned out to be true. I was standing near the coffee station at the end of the first day, holding a cup I had poured but not yet tasted, reading a message on my phone, and Daniel walked up beside me and said, in a voice much quieter than I expected, "That coffee has been sitting on the burner since this morning. I would avoid it if I were you." I looked up. He was watching me with a half smile he used when he thought he was funnier than he was. I told him I had already poured it. He handed me his unopened bottle of water without another word. That was Daniel. We talked for 2 hours that evening. Not the way people talk at conferences, circling the surface of things, handing each other professional identities like name cards. We talked the way you talk when you have both been tired for a long time and something about the other person makes you forget that for a moment. He told me about growing up in Raleigh, about his mother Patricia, who had raised him mostly alone after his father left when Daniel was 9 years old, about the way she had worked 2 jobs for 3 years without once letting him see how exhausted she was. He talked about her the way some people talk about gravity. The force that holds everything in place, taken for granted until you imagine what the world would look like without it. I listened to every word. I thought it was one of the most honest things I had ever heard a man say. We dated for 14 months before he introduced me to Patricia. I had asked about her often in those early months. Daniel spoke about her with a warmth that made me genuinely look forward to meeting her. But there was something at the edges of those conversations, not anything I could name at the time, just a particular way certain subjects would quietly close. Not abruptly. More like a door easing shut rather than slamming. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room before you can find the source. I assumed it was the residue of a complicated history. His father leaving had been hard on Patricia in ways Daniel said she never fully processed. That explanation satisfied me for a long time. I was wrong to let it. The night I met Patricia, Daniel drove me to her house in Raleigh for Sunday dinner. She opened the front door before we even reached it, as though she had been watching the driveway, and she pulled me into a hug I was not expecting and held it 2 beats longer than a first greeting usually lasts. When she stepped back, she held me by both arms and looked at me with an expression I can only describe now, from this distance, as relief. At the time I read it as warmth. She was warm, there is no question about that. Dinner was pot roast and sweet tea and a peach cobbler she had made from scratch because Daniel had mentioned, during a phone call months earlier, that I loved peaches. She had remembered that. She had planned around it. That is the kind of woman Patricia was. Attentive in a way that felt like love. And in many ways, it was love. That is the part that made everything that came later so much harder to untangle. Patricia did love me. I believe that completely, even now. What I had to learn, slowly and at great personal cost, was that love and honesty do not always live in the same house. A person can hold you with genuine warmth and still be keeping something from you that belongs to you. A person can cry real tears and still be crying for reasons they have chosen never to say out loud. Patricia loved me. And Patricia had a secret. And for years those 2 things existed side by side inside her without her ever finding a way to reconcile them. That is the human part of this story. That is the part one want you to hold on to as we go further in. Daniel proposed in March of 2015. We were at a restaurant in downtown Raleigh that we had been to on our first official date, and he had arranged with the owner to have a small note tucked under my dessert plate, the same bottle of water he had handed me at that conference, with a ring resting against it. It was so specifically him, practical and sentimental at the same time, that I started laughing before I even understood what was happening. I said yes before he finished the sentence. And the first person he called, standing outside on the sidewalk in the March cold while I was still shaking, was his mother. I stood beside him and listened to his side of the call and heard him say, she said yes, Mom, and heard the sound that came through the phone, a sound that filled the whole street. Patricia was overjoyed. I had no reason on earth to think otherwise. Planning the wedding brought Patricia and me even closer. She threw herself into it with an energy that was contagious and sometimes exhausting. She had opinions about flowers and strong feelings about table linens and a particular position on whether the ceremony should begin at 3 in the afternoon or 4. We disagreed about several things and agreed about more, and through all of it she treated me with a respect and a genuine interest that made me feel chosen. Not just by Daniel, but by her. That feeling matters in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has not experienced it. Growing up, my own family had been difficult. My parents divorced when I was 12, and the years that followed had a particular kind of instability that I had spent most of my adult life quietly trying to put behind me. Patricia felt like what I had always wanted a family to feel like. Safe, steady, present. There was one afternoon, about 4 months before the wedding, when Patricia and I were sitting at her kitchen table going over the seating chart. It was a Sunday, Daniel was at the hardware store, and we had been at it for 2 hours and were both starting to lose our minds a little over where to put his cousin Gerald, who apparently had a history with 2 separate people on the guest list. Patricia got up to make more tea, and I remember she stood at the counter with her back to me for a moment longer than necessary. When she turned around, her expression had changed. Just slightly. A flicker of something that did not match the afternoon. She set the tea down and looked at me and said, "You know how much I love you, Rachel." I told her I did. She nodded and sat back down and picked up the seating chart and said, "Good. I just wanted to say it." And that was it. We moved on. I thought nothing of it in the moment. I would think about it constantly later. The wedding was on a Saturday in October of 2016 at a church in Chapel Hill that Daniel's grandmother had attended for 40 years. The day was overcast in the morning and cleared by noon, which felt like a gift. I got ready at the hotel with my 2 best friends, my sister and my mother, who cried the moment she saw me in the dress and did not really stop for the rest of the day. Everything felt exactly the way you hope it will feel and rarely does. The small disasters that every wedding contains, a bridesmaid's zipper that would not cooperate, a florist who delivered the centerpieces an hour late, stayed small. They did not bleed into the larger feeling of the day, which was one of pure and uncomplicated happiness. That was real. That happiness was real. I want to be clear about that because what came later does not erase what was true in those hours. I did not see Patricia crying at the back of the church before the ceremony. I learned about it 3 days later, on our honeymoon in Asheville, when Daniel mentioned it while we were having breakfast on the porch of the cabin we had rented. He said it so easily, smiling into his coffee cup, telling me as though it were a small and lovely detail he had been saving to share. He said his Aunt Carol had texted him a photo of Patricia standing at the back of the church before the procession, and that his mother looked like she had been crying for a while. He found it touching. He told me she must have arrived early and just stood there taking it all in. He said it again, the thing he had said at the church when someone mentioned it to him. "She never cries. She must really love you." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand when he said it. And I smiled. And I let it go. And a part of me, some small and unnamed part, filed it away without knowing why. The first year of our marriage was the closest thing to ordinary happiness I have ever lived. We had bought a house in Durham 6 months before the wedding, a 3-bedroom on a street with old oak trees that dropped so many leaves in the fall that raking became its own event. Patricia came to visit often, sometimes just for the weekend, and she and I had developed a rhythm that I valued enormously. We would cook together on Saturday evenings when she visited, and she had started teaching me her pot roast recipe in stages, as though each visit unlocked the next layer of instruction. It was warm. It was real. And underneath all of it, completely invisible to me, something was waiting. The first moment I felt it was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because I think when people tell stories like this, they sometimes compress the timeline in ways that make the teller seem more perceptive than they were. I was not perceptive. I was happy, which is a condition that makes you less rather than more observant. The first moment came about 16 months into our marriage, on a Thursday evening in February of 2018. Patricia had called Daniel while I was in the next room. I was not eavesdropping. I was folding laundry on the bed with the door open while he sat in the living room talking to her, which was ordinary. But then the tone of his voice shifted in a way I registered before I consciously understood what I was registering. It dropped. And he said, very quietly, "Mom, we talked about this." And then a pause. And then I know. But that was before. And the call ended shortly after, and when he came in he was easy and normal and asked me what I wanted to do for dinner. I did not ask him what the call was about. I have asked myself many times since why I did not ask. The honest answer is that I did not want to know. Not yet. Not when things felt so good. But the body keeps a record of the things the mind decides not to look at directly. Over the months that followed, I found myself paying attention to Daniel's phone calls with Patricia in a way I had not before. Not obsessively. Just differently. The way you start noticing a sound in your house after you have heard it once in the night. Most of the calls were entirely ordinary. But there were 3 or 4 over the course of about 8 months where I caught that same quality. The lowered voice. The abbreviated response. The too easy transition back to normal when he came to find me afterward. I told myself I was reading something into nothing. Marriages have private conversations. Adults have histories they do not itemize for their spouses. None of this was evidence of anything. I kept telling myself that. What I did not do, and what I wish I had done, was simply ask him directly what was happening. I did not ask because I trusted him. And I trusted Patricia. And sometimes trust is the thing that keeps you patient when you should be paying closer attention. The conversation that changed everything did not happen between Daniel and me. It happened between me and Patricia on a Sunday afternoon in September of 2018, 2 years into our marriage. Daniel had gone to pick up groceries, something he always did alone because he found it meditative in a way I found genuinely baffling, but had long since stopped questioning. Patricia and I were in the kitchen. I was making coffee. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a glass of water, and she had been quiet for longer than usual, which for Patricia was noticeable. And then she said my name. Just Rachel, in a particular way, not the way you say someone's name to get their attention, but the way you say it when you have been rehearsing the conversation you are about to start. I turned around. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was the face of someone who has been carrying a weight for a very long time and has finally, against everything they decided, set it down. She told me she needed to tell me something. She said she had wanted to tell me for a long time and had not found the right moment, and that she was no longer sure a right moment existed, so she had decided to simply say it. She asked me to sit down. I sat. And what she told me in the next 23 minutes rearranged everything I thought I knew about the 2 years I had just lived, and the years before them that I had only heard described. I am going to tell you what she said. But before I do, I want you to understand something about the way she said it, because the content alone does not carry the full weight of that conversation. She was not confessing in the way that people confess when they want to be absolved. She was not crying. She was precise and careful, and she kept her eyes on mine throughout, which I have thought about many times since. She had decided to tell me the truth, and she was not going to flinch while she did it. Whatever you think about what Patricia did, she was not a coward in that kitchen. She told me that before I met Daniel, during the 2 years before that conference in Charlotte, Daniel had been in a relationship with a woman named Melissa. They had dated for just over 3 years. Patricia had loved Melissa. That was the first thing she said, and she said it plainly, not as a comparison, but as a fact she wanted me to have. Melissa had been close to the family in a way that felt permanent. She came to holidays. She knew Patricia's house as well as her own. And then, about a year before Daniel and I met, something had happened between Daniel and Melissa that ended the relationship. Patricia told me that Daniel had made a choice that caused Melissa significant pain, a choice he was not proud of and had never fully disclosed to me, and that Patricia had known about it from the moment it happened. She had watched her son navigate the end of that relationship and the beginning of ours. She had watched him build something real with me. And she had made a decision, the decision that brought her to the back of that church in a pale blue dress with tears she could not stop, that the right thing to do was to let the past stay in the past. She had been wrong. She knew she had been wrong. That was why she was telling me now. Not because anything had changed in the facts themselves, but because she had watched me for 2 years build a life with her son on a foundation that had a crack in it she had helped to hide, and she could not keep doing it. She said she did not know what I would do with what she was telling me. She said she understood if I was angry with her. And then she folded her hands on the table and waited. And the kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. And outside, in the driveway, I heard Daniel's car. I have been asked many times how I felt in that moment. The honest answer is that I felt strangely calm. Not numb, not dissociated, but calm in the way you become calm when something you have half known without knowing it finally takes a shape you can look at directly. The low voice on the phone calls. The conversation I had half heard about something that happened before. The way Patricia had looked at me on that Sunday 4 months before the wedding and said, "You know how much I love you, Rachel," with an urgency that I had smiled at and filed away. All of it landed at once, and it landed quietly, which is not what I expected. I had always imagined that if something like this ever happened, I would feel the floor go out from under me. Instead, I felt the floor become more solid. I finally knew what I was standing on. I did not tell Daniel that night that I had spoken to his mother. I needed time. Not days, just hours. I needed to sit with what Patricia had told me and understand it in full before I brought it to him, because I knew that how I brought it would determine everything about what happened next. That night we had dinner and watched something on television, and he fell asleep before me, and I lay in the dark beside him, and I thought about a woman standing at the back of a church, unable to stop crying. Watching her son marry someone she genuinely loved while carrying the one piece of information that could change what that marriage was built on. And I thought about whether that made her a good person or a bad one. I still do not have a clean answer to that question. What I have instead is something more complicated and probably more true, which is that she was a mother who loved her son and made a decision she believed was protecting everyone, and then spent 2 years discovering that protection and honesty are not the same thing. And sometimes the choice between them costs more than you planned. I told Daniel the next morning. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table, the same table where Patricia had sat the day before with her hands around her glass of water, and I told him that his mother had talked to me. I watched his face go through several things in a short space of time. Confusion first, then recognition, then something I can only describe as the expression of a person who has just realized that a door they thought was locked has been open for longer than they knew. He did not deny it. He did not try to reframe it. He sat there and he listened, and when I was done talking, he put his face in his hands for a moment, and then he looked up and he said, "I should have told you before the wedding. I know that. I have known that." And that was when I cried. Not because of what Patricia had told me, not because of what Daniel was telling me now, but because of the simplicity of those words and what they cost him to say. He had known. And he had carried it. And now we were both sitting in the truth of it, across a kitchen table, in a house we had built together on a Tuesday morning with nowhere else to go. What Daniel told me over the following days was this. Before we met, his relationship with Melissa had ended because he had been unfaithful to her. Once. A moment he described as the worst decision of his adult life, and the one he had spent the most time reconstructing in the years since, trying to understand how a person who considered himself decent had done something that indecent. He had not carried on a relationship. He had not been in love with someone else. He had made a single choice in a moment of weakness that ended a 3-year relationship and left a woman he genuinely cared about with a wound he could not repair because she had, correctly, removed him from her life. He had told his mother. He had not told me. And Patricia, watching us fall in love and build something real, had made the judgment that what happened before I entered the picture was Daniel's to disclose or not, and that her role was to support her son and trust his judgment. By the time the wedding came, she had been holding that judgment for long enough that it had become its own kind of anchor. Standing at the back of that church, watching me walk toward her son, she had understood, maybe for the first time completely, that she had been wrong. The tears were not joy. They were the weight of a decision finally acknowledged for what it was. What happened to our marriage after that is the part that surprised everyone, including me. We did not fall apart. I want to be honest about that because I think this kind of story is often told as a destruction narrative, and ours was not. What happened instead was something slower and harder and ultimately more real than the version of our marriage that had existed before that Tuesday morning. We went to counseling. Not because we were at the edge of something, but because we both understood that what had been revealed was not a crisis, but a crack, and cracks require attention if you want the structure to hold. We talked for months about honesty and what it means to build a life with someone and what you owe the person you have chosen. We talked about Patricia, whose role in all of it was the most complicated piece to work through, because she was not the villain of the story, and she was not the hero either. She was a woman who had made a human decision and then lived long enough inside it to understand its full cost. I spoke to Patricia alone once more, about 3 months after Daniel, and I had begun to work through everything. I drove to Raleigh on a Saturday, and we sat in her living room and we talked for a long time. She did not ask for my forgiveness in those words. What she said was that she had told me because she believed I deserved to know, and that she was prepared to accept whatever I decided about our relationship going forward. I told her that what I had decided was that I was going to stop trying to make her into one thing. She was not the warm woman I had loved before I knew, and she was not the woman who had deceived me. She was both of those women at the same time, held together by a love for her son that had made her capable of both warmth and silence in equal measure. I told her I was not ready to go back to what we had been before, but I was not willing to lose her either. We sat with that for a while. And then she got up and made tea, because that is what Patricia does when she does not know what to say next. And I let her. Daniel and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary in October of 2021. We were back in Asheville, the same cabin, the same porch where he had told me about his mother crying at the back of the church and called it tears of joy. We did not talk about all of it that morning, we did not need to, but I thought about it. I thought about the version of us that had sat at that table in the early days of our marriage, happy and unknowing, and I thought about what it had cost us to become the version sitting there now, more knowing and more honest and, I believe, more real. Marriages are not built once. They are built over and over from whatever materials the truth provides. Ours had been partially rebuilt from something difficult. What we built the second time was stronger, because we both knew exactly what we were building on. Patricia still comes for Sunday dinners. The pot roast recipe is fully mine now. She finished teaching it to me the Christmas before last, in stages, the way she always does things. We do not talk about that Sunday in the kitchen unless one of us brings it up, which is rare. What we have instead is something quieter and more durable than what came before it, a relationship built on the knowledge that we have seen each other at our most human and chosen to remain. There is a particular kind of trust that only becomes possible after something has broken. I did not know that before. I know it now. If you have made it this far, I want to ask you something honestly. And I want you to think about it before you answer in the comments. If you had been Patricia, standing at the back of that church, watching your son marry a woman you genuinely loved, carrying a secret that was his to tell, but that he had chosen not to, what would you have done? Would you have told the truth before the wedding? Would you have held it the way she did and hoped that love was enough to cover what honesty had not said? There is no clean answer. I have sat with this question for years, and I still do not have one. What I have instead is the belief that the people who love us are capable of both protecting us and failing us with the same hands, sometimes in the same moment. And that understanding that is not the end of love. It might, if you let it, be the beginning of a deeper kind. That is Rachel's story. And if it stayed with you, I want you to come back for the next one. Because the woman in our next story also thought she was the only one keeping a secret. She was not. And what happened when it came out changed far more than one marriage. Subscribe to Claudia's Untold Stories so you are here when that story drops. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You know who that is.